About myself, I have a VC fund. I focus on network states and charter cities, right? So these are two concepts that are linked, right? So I'm going to first talk a bit about the network states so we all have a baseline, and then I'm going to tell you why it's not the one thing that people are most surprised by. It's not like something that's 10 or 15 years into the future. It's already here. There's already several functioning entities, some even with diplomatic recognition and existing territory. Who has read the book by Balaji? All right, cool. So which network states do you know? Or which ones can you think of? Know anyone? Prospera? Cabindao? Yeah, these are some cool ones. Afropolitan is, I think, the one that's most closely following the model of Balaji, right? And it's a very interesting model. So for anyone who's new to this, a network state is a highly aligned online community that has its own crypto economy and that has an in-person level of civility, right? So these people also interact in real life. It's not just Discord servers. And they eventually crowdfund territory, right? So Cabindao is a good example. So they have land, they're building their own cabins. And then, and that's the key part, eventually gain diplomatic recognition. So you can become your own entity that has a degree of legal autonomy and of recognition. That's interesting, right? So the subtitle of the book is Start a New Country. Now, what many people don't know is that this is kind of an innovation on top of an existing model, right? So the model that was before the network state, I would call the charter city or startup city model. It comes a bit out of the seasteading movement, Patrick Friedman, right? So the idea is, what if we can set up kind of new entities and do new experiments in governance, right? So we can make better laws, we can have better ways to like fund public goods or things like that. Things that we also care a lot about in the Web3 community. And the first attempt was, hey, governments have all the territory in the world, so where can we go? And the idea was, hey, we can go into the ocean and build seaports, right? And have like floating cities. Some of those exist, but the big problem with that was it was too expensive, right? So there's a lot of corrosion with like the bodies, the floating cities that you need on the water. So the next stage of the idea was, what if we convince existing governments to form a public-private partnership? And the model that was influencing that was Shenzhen in China. To some degree Hong Kong, to some degree Singapore, to some degree Dubai. So the model of special economic zones. You get legal autonomy on a small scale to upgrade governance and attract business and attract and do growth and development. What it worked fantastically well. Some of these cities grew in 30 to 50 cities from very poor hinterlands into wealthy megacities. This is a charter city model, and there's a couple of ones out there. Right, so Prosper is one. I live in Prosper, right? It's on a Caribbean island that's part of the country of Honduras. And there's places like Nkwashi in Zambia. A new charter city is Talent City in Nigeria in a free zone. We also have a fellow here, Florian, who's getting a free zone status for a charter city in Zanzibar in Tanzania. So it's an existing model and it's out there, yeah. And there's more things coming online this year, which is really cool. But Balaji came and it was like, wait guys, it's really, really hard to get these partnerships, right? This is sort of the most enterprise sales you can possibly do, right? You have to go into multi-stakeholder negotiations with the biggest corporations in the world. So that can take years. You often need like existing relationships to build that kind of leverage. So that was like, what if you are an ambitious founder and you don't have that? You don't have the ability right now. It would take you 5 to 10 years to get this kind of level of partnership before you can do anything. Well, what if you can already start right now? And this is where Balaji flipped the charter city model upside down. You can start with that community in the cloud, right? So you have a community that's highly aligned around a moral innovation. It's like, hey, we want to be like a keto or longevity-focused network state. Like that's what all binds us together. Or Afropolitan, like the governance for Africans all over the world is really bad, right? So what if we help each other get like a super app that helps us have our own economy? What if we eventually get like an embassy that has IDs, right? So I experienced this myself. So I was helping Ukrainian families get out of Ukraine when the war started, but Ukraine had a lot of African students and they couldn't get out, right? So because there was no embassy lobbying for them, and in the EU the travel restrictions were too harsh. So this is where Afropolitan comes in. What if we can build that leverage, that kind of recognition to help the people that are our members or in our network state? Right, so this is the idea of Balaji, and only then, when you have that leverage, you're in a much better position to get these deals with governments, right? So what if you're like 20,000 people in Austin that are very high earning, it's all tech workers, and hey, we want this one thing. Can you change the regulations so we can do like our longevity or biohacking experiments? That's the idea. And I think it's a brilliant idea. I think this can bring more startups to the starting line, right? It has already brought startups to the starting line like Afropolitan and like Praxis, right? So I'm a very proud member of Afropolitan. I think they're on a very great trajectory. Too bad that Chika and Eche Emole, the founders, are not here right now. So I see it as my responsibility to shield them a bit right now. And if you want to hear a bit more about Afropolitan, go to their website, afropolitan.io. Also, I interviewed Etche on my podcast, the Stranded Technologies podcast, where he's talking about his vision that's in 4 stages, right? So first, you have a citizenship, a citizen pass in Afropolitan that you can mint as an NFT. I think there's still 30 or 50 passes left out of the first 500. I'm number 91. And then in the next stage, they build a super app where people can connect and give each other help and services and organize events all over the world. And in the third stage, they want to get Afro towns in different parts around the world, right? Again, so go to governments and use the Chinatown model. Hey, we have a couple of people, we want to have things a little different, a little bit of autonomy in this way, and this way kind of build better governance for Afropolitan members. Right, so this is about the network state, and I think right now is actually a pivotal moment. I'm personally hearing a lot about it right now, right? So I work with tons of people who have been in the, before it was called startup society, startup cities, charter cities. They've been working on it for like decades, but never has there been more of a buzz around it, right? It was they're absolutely amazed when they come to, or when I come to conferences like this, and now I have something to point to. Oh yeah, Balaji and the network state, right? So with that said, I just want to make one last point, and then maybe can open it up to questions, because I'm sure it's a very new concept to many of you, so you have lots of questions. But the one thing I also want to talk briefly about is where I'm based, Prosper. So in my view, Prosper is the most advanced network state. Even though it doesn't follow Balaji's model, it started more as a charter city. But it is based on a Caribbean island, on the island of Roatan. It's a beautiful island. It has an existing legal system that's very innovative. It's called regulatory flexibility. So it has a business registry. You can start a business. We are already doing biotech there in clinical trials. We are already doing autonomous drone delivery. We're already doing robotic construction. It's going to be a very futuristic entrepreneurial city. It also has governance services. So the creator of Estonia, who created Estonia e-residency, is the director of product for the Prosper e-governance platform. And we have really cool territory. It has about 200 acres. It's about the size of Monaco. Densely populated, it could be 40,000 people. So I'm a big fan of the community there. I think what they do really well is they are doing really good job for the locals there. They provide a lot of employment for local Hondurans that live on the island and entrepreneurs from the mainland for whom it's a better environment to do business. I'm organizing several conferences there on the island. The one that's most closest to what we're doing here, it's a DeFi conference on March 5 to 7. So if you go to infinitavc.com, you can find out all about that and visit us on the island. It's a real stunning experience. Yeah, that's about me, that's about network states and my 2 cents. I would love to open it up to a couple of questions from the audience. Yes?
Just wondering, you said, you gave examples of many African countries who have these states already existing. like, how does that work? Do they their governments, the coordination between, like, how come they're so advanced that the government accepts starting these things, or are they doing it independently?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So why do governments accept these deals, right? And why specifically in Africa, right? So the idea is it's supercharging economic development. And I was just talking about this today with someone on my podcast. The key is that you generate local benefits. So these zones, they typically have a clause in the public-private partnership that the local government gets a tax revenue from the economic activities of the zone. Right, so in Tanzania, for example, you get like a 5% revenue share of the economic activities. And they also have an ownership share in the zone. Right, so they have, in Prosper it's similar. The Honduran government gets 12% of the tax revenue of Prosper. Right, so again, the example that is closest to it is Shenzhen in China. Right, so Shenzhen was rapidly developing, and it proved to be an experiment that worked in other parts of China. So other than that, they did more of these zones, and that basically delivered economic development to people. It's a very good model. And now specifically in Africa, well, Africa, there's many countries with lots of poverty. This is where it could especially help supercharge economic development. A lot of the problems in Africa is bad institutions and bad governance, bad access to internet, to Wi-Fi, bad access to electricity very often. And very often, yes?
So does corruption of the government, like, how does that, what's the experience of corruption and these network states? How do these things mesh?
Yeah, so the question is corruption and network states, right? So network states, like existing states, have people run them, and people do bad things, and there's bad actors. So there is, of course, it can come to corruption. Huh? Oh. Yeah. So can corruption kind of hamper the development of network state zones? Actually, I think that's a very good question. It's something very important to look out for, right? Because this is a bigger conversation, but there is a longer history of special economic zones. Not many people know this, but there's more than 5,000, maybe 10,000 special economic zones all over the world. There's tons in Africa, right? Many of them are good and fine. They're like for manufacturing, for export processing, for tax advantages. To do some kinds of businesses, it's almost impossible with the existing legislation in the country. There are others, very often they're prone to political influence or political favors. And there's also examples of special economic zones in Laos, for example, in the border with China, where you had reports of very bad stuff going on, corruption and human trafficking and things like that. So like anything else, it's prone to bad actors entering the space. So we in the space, in the network state space, we need to be very careful and it's like any startup, you need to do it 10 times better than the existing competition, right? So we got to be really careful that we do it right ethically, and that we do it in a way that it attracts people to opt in voluntarily, and that it gives people options, and that we get deals with governments that are kind of aligned on that vision, right? So that's very important for the future of network states. Any other questions?
Yeah, where can I find out more information about the Prosper project?
Find out more information about Prosper, prospera.hn. Prospera is Prospera.hn.
What are you guys doing at Prospera towards sustainability and food production?
Yeah, sustainability and food production in Prospera. Prosper is a platform for entrepreneurs, so we invite entrepreneurs to help us with all of these things, whatever they think is a fit for that. When it comes to sustainability specifically, Roatan has one of the most beautiful and biggest coral reefs in the world. So protection of the coral reef is anchored in the Constitution. Also, what I think is a very good method of organizing commons is property rights in 3D on the blockchain. Right? So whenever you're debating air rights or like building, whatever, that is easier and there's more liquid market for that, right? So you don't have to argue with governments, can I build there or not build there? It's much easier to form a cooperative. Hey, we want to kind of do our own national park that is governed by a DAO and is tokenized. So I think the legal platform of Prospera is extremely well designed to make sustainability possible, right? And to create sort of better structures around that.
What kind of people move down to Prosper, and then what sorts of people become members of Afropolitan?
So what kind of members are...
Like who's the target member for Prosper and Afropolitan?
The target member of Afropolitan and of Prosper? Yeah. So no one here from Afropolitan? Right, so for Afropolitan, it's mostly diaspora Africans. I'm an exception, right? I'm not from Africa, right? But I'm interested in that ecosystem. I'm a VC. I want to help sort of entrepreneurs that use these platforms, right? But other than that, it's diaspora Africans and Africans that suffer from bad governance anywhere, right? When it comes to Prospera, it's a bit, the platform is mostly for entrepreneurs, right? So for entrepreneurs and anyone who wants to upgrade and improve their life, right? So about 2/3 of the people in Prospera are from Honduras, right? So about half of them is local islanders that do service work, that work as security guards, taxi drivers. One of them is running a nonprofit for a school to help local children. And the other third is educated Hondurans from the mainland, right? So their alternative is typically to go to the United States to find opportunity. Instead, they could come to Prospera and, hey, I have opportunity here and I can help lift my own country out of poverty. This is honestly what motivated me to join the community, because this is like a spirit of, hey, this is our life's mission, right? This is not just a company we're building, this is like a life's mission. And the other third is internationals. There is other Latin Americans involved. The founders of Prosper are actually from Guatemala and Venezuela. And much of the staff is American and European like me. But it's an open platform, anyone can join who thinks it is the right thing to upgrade their lives.
Hi, Nick. If we imagine in the future there are many network states, have you ever imagined, is there any coordination mechanism beyond those network states?
What relationship between network states?
Coordination and mechanism beyond those states.
Yeah. Great. So is there some
like UN?
Yeah. So is there kind of coordination between network states? How do we want that to look in the future? Actually, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing with my VC. I want to help kind of build a network of network states, right? Because we're doing something fundamentally new. We have 0.0 something % market share, right? And there's much more to gain for the network states to help each other than to compete, in my opinion, right? I want to vastly increase the space of options. And I think we can do that best by cooperating, by being open source, by sharing what we learn from each other, kind of the legal templates, how to, what edge cases have you encountered, like when it comes to ethics, and how did you make your legal system work, and, I want to share all this data together, right? The point of this is that we radically improve governance, right? We've just started. This is just the beginning. I think governance innovation has not happened for a couple of decades, maybe hundreds of years in some area. So I want this to become a movement where we can try out different things, right? So one network state might be more libertarian, the other might provide more public goods funding and more government services and sort of a universal basic income, for example, right? So these would be, I think, the ideal places to test out what actually works in practice. So I think this network of network states idea is very, very important to me.
Thank you.
What do you think the biggest challenges facing Afropolitan will be in the early days?
Mm-hmm. The biggest challenges for Afropolitan? Good question. So I think they have a very compelling strategy. I really like the clarity of their vision, right? I think they're really taking the Balaji model and they're like hyper-focused and executing. At the same time, it's a startup, it's risky. It's very hard to build a lasting business initially when you're very small, right? So part of their ambition is, for example, to build a community and then build a super app on top, right? So you have to almost build like multiple startups. So I think that's the biggest challenge, that they're aiming to create kind of multiple startups within one. I think it makes sense. It's a very coherent strategy. But I think it's similar challenges to any other startup, right? That you initially face a lot of skepticism. You need to find the best talent in the world to execute really fast and grow. And you're going to experience a lot of setbacks. And you hopefully, and I believe Afropolitan has a great community to pull it off.
Thank you.
Hi. What is the state of like the court system and criminal justice system in Prospera?
Yeah, court and justice system in Prosper, very good question, because it's actually one of the most important pieces, right? So Prosper is aiming to build also a private arbitration services, right? So, and private insurance services. So by default, the regulation is that you need to have liability insurance, both for you as a person and for your business, right? So that's the default. And then you need to agree to binding arbitration in case there's a dispute. So you can select your arbitrator and your court for your business and for your personal activities. That said, right now there's only one insurance of last resort, which is Prosper itself, and only one arbitration court, which is Prosper itself. But you have the option to also use the ICC, the International Criminal Court, right? So you can even sue Prospera if you feel that they're violating their contract with you, right? So when you become a citizen of Prosper, you have like a real social contract, not just a hypothetical one. And Prosper can be held liable for that contract under international law, right? So it's both these things and kind of building a polycentric legal system within Prosper. It's a really, really fascinating idea, polycentric law. The author of much of the work is called Tom W. Bell. I had him on my podcast in episode 7. It's really, really fascinating. But the idea is, yeah, you have more flexible legal options. It's not like you're in one jurisdiction and one government can decide what you can and can't do, is that you have a say. You need to be insured, right? So there's the incentives, there's a common law-based legal system, so it's not that there's no regulations or anything, right? So in the opposite, this is supposed to ensure that there's even less of bad behavior this way, right?
So if you're a citizen, or what was the classification for someone that lives in Prospera?
Yeah.
Is it citizen?
I'm right now an e-resident, but I'm in the process to get full citizenship.
So if, in order to be an e-resident, or as a condition of being an e-resident, you are paying a personal insurance premium?
Premium, what the insurance premium is?
No, sorry. Are you paying a monthly insurance premium as a part of being
annual?
A citizen?
Yes.
Annual.
So
okay.
e-residency is $130 a year. Full residency is $1,300 a year. Business incorporation is something like $300 for the entity, and I think $225 for the insurance annually.
Okay. Thank you.
Plus registered agents. So cheaper than Delaware. So.
Same question, but for police.
Private police.
Private police.
That was there on the island before. That's not an innovation that Prospera has.
Can individuals choose their enforcement as well?
Well, Prospera is kind of the customer right now of private police services for their own borders of jurisdiction, right? When it comes to kind of your own property within Prospera, then I think I'm pretty sure you do have the option to get private security services. Yes.
That's really cool.
All the way in the back. Yeah.
On a similar note, how does the tax system works? Are there incentives for it? And also, part 2 of the question, how's Prospera sustainable because it's startups? So I'm assuming there's not a lot of incoming money, and how do they keep, you said they tax the people to keep it sustainable. How does that work?
Yeah. So the first question was about the tax system in Prospera. And the second question is basically what's Prospera's business model, how do they generate income? So the tax question, there's a 5% income tax if you're full resident, which is very good. That's why I'm gaining full residency. There's no capital gains tax. There's a 2.5% value add tax on economic activities within the zone, which is opposed to 16% on the island of Roatan. And there's a 1% tax on business revenue, which is kind of required for international compliance anyway, right? It's kind of like a stripe fee. So these are the three pillars basically of the tax system. And by constitution, the effective tax rate can never exceed 10%. So that's one source of income for Prospera. I think the second one is from leasing land and real estate multiples, right? So I'm actually have scheduled a podcast episode with Prospera's Chief Development Officer to better understand that. But from what I understand now, a big part of the value proposition is, hey, we're going to take this land that was uninhabited before and not very valuable or generating a lot of production, and we make it super productive, right? So that increases the land value by like 20, 50, 100 times, right? So they're capturing part of the increasing land value. So that's an important component of it. And the third part is they're also planning to set up, or they have already set up as partly also why I'm there, investment in some companies that are going to set up there, right? Because they provide a lot of legal help, they provide a lot of setup help, right? So they invested in my VC fund, right? So I'm also indirectly generating revenue for them this way. Yeah, yeah. Or can you just tell me? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So what is the relationship between the, let's say, the government of Honduras and Prospera? At which end it's independent or absolutely involved in the local?
Yeah. So Prospera is part of the sovereign country of Honduras, right? So Prospera doesn't have sovereignty, right? And I also discussed it with Prospera's CMO. We think Balaji's idea of sovereignty, we don't necessarily need that, and Prospera doesn't want that, right? So it has legal autonomy. The limiting factors are Honduran criminal law and Honduran immigration law. So Honduran immigration and criminal law applies in Prospera. So those are some limiting factors. Prospera has the status of a special economic zone within the legal framework of Honduras. That's part of the Constitution of Honduras, right? So they have a governing body that is authorized by the Constitution of Honduras. That's also subject to oversight, right? So there are several levels of oversight over Prospera, the entity, but there are legal stability guarantees. So the Honduran government can say, oh, we're going to change this now, we don't like it this way, or we increase taxes or whatever. Why? Because they've committed to an international treaty that says that the government can't interfere with investor security, right? So anything that can be construed as they're endangering investment in Prospera, that the Honduran government could be held accountable for. So that's the legal status of Prospera.
Hello? And what about the other cities? Maybe not Prospera, but any of them got real autonomy?
So what about the other cities? So Honduras is particularly interesting. There's one more charter city in Honduras. It's called Ciudad Morazán. Also a big fan of it. If Prospera is kind of more the Silicon Valley style for tech entrepreneurs piece, Ciudad Morazán is for blue-collar workers, right? So it's in a very dangerous part of the country and provides basic security service and affordable housing. You can rent a one-family house there for $120 a month, which is crazy. That's by slashing all the costs of building and of construction. So Honduras has that framework, and right now that framework is disputed, unfortunately, but Honduras allows generally private city developers or city developers in general to create that zone status. What about other cities? It depends on the country, right? So there are some countries that have precedent with free zones. So Nigeria, for example, as far as I'm aware of, has free zones. So Helen City is basically getting legal autonomy or zone status under Nigerian law. But it really differs. Honduras is right now by far the best in the world when it comes to the kind of the quality of the legal status, right? And other countries, many countries have the possibility to do these zones, but it's much harder to get them, or they don't have as much legal autonomy, right? So I know of another one in Zambia, for example, that has very strong kind of a very strong status, also because they have very strong relationships with the government, right? So the former finance minister, for example, is involved. So that's kind of the background. That's, again, going back to what I said earlier, it's very hard to get the status of these zones, which is why Balaji said, hey, let's figure out a model where we can start earlier. Looking at time? Right, thanks very much. I'll be around if you have more questions.
Thank you, Nick.